You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. And this is the podcast where we explore more of the nature of masculinity in today's society. So for this episode, I want to deep dive into the multi-layered landscape of relationships and just another layer from the other podcasts that's preceded it. I want to particularly look at their evolution from childhood to adulthood. Now, again, everybody, keep in mind that in 20 minutes, I'm packing a lot in, right? So I'm condensing what could be a series of, 1 to 2 hour lectures into 20 minutes to give you as much of a feel of the topic as possible. One of the other things I want to do in this is actually connect it with the whole idea of social structures, okay? And as you guys know, I've been talking a lot about the desperate need to begin to deconstruct patriarchy as a social ideology, okay? Because, it's just toxic, right? Remember, masculinity is not toxic, it's patriarchy. Okay, so where are we going to start? I often sort of get asked about why I'm connecting social ideology with psychological effects. And in a sense, the answer is quite simple. Because humans inherently are social beings. The relationships that weave the tapestry of our lives and that significantly shape our emotional and psychological landscape occur within the context of certain ideologies that shape not just us, but society. And it's a feedback loop. Okay? So this applies to really coming to understand our emotional and romantic relationships. Right? So we have emotional, sexual, romantic relationships, we have intellectual relationships, and we have social relationships. So where's there a good place to start? Well, as always, our journey really begins in childhood, right? And it's probably fair to say that it actually starts the moment that we're conceived. But let's stay with childhood. So the relationships formed during these formative years more than likely primarily involve family members, mum, dad, brothers, sisters. And in this context, and you've heard me talk about attachment theory before, it's at this point we're introduced to the whole notion of attachment, which was brought to bear by John Bowlby and Ainsworth. And essentially, it proposes that the nature of care received during those early years shape our attachment styles, which in turn actually influence our future relationships. Now, as a psychotherapist, I can tell you that this is not up for debate, okay? I don't want anybody out there suddenly going, oh yeah, but that's conjecture. This is factual, right? So let me take it a bit further. So what do I mean then by attachment styles? Well, attachment styles come in a couple of versions. One is secure, the other one's anxious, then there's an avoidant one, and then there's a disorganized one. And they form the blueprint for our interactions. So, for example, the secure attachment style often leads to healthier relationships in adulthood, while an insecure style can result in various challenges. Now, it's really interesting because a lot of the guys that I work with are struggling with the fundamental questions that exist about them in relationship with women and, other partners. They may not be women, they could be another man. And so, for those men who consistently find themselves struggling in this context of a relationship, a lot of the answers lie actually in their attachment style. So, one of the things we want to then do is take the next level, right? And let's segue into adulthood and really focus on this whole notion of romantic relationships. Now, they're complex. Most romantic relationships involve emotional, intellectual, and physical connections. At least I hope so. Now, our childhood attachments are reflected in these relationships. But it's also important to note that personal growth and experiences can positively alter these dynamics. So, in essence, you're sort of not condemned to be totally determined by your past. I mean, that'd be scary as hell, wouldn't it? So, one of the cornerstones in adult romantic relationships then is understanding what Dr. Gary Chapman calls love languages. And he talks about several types of love languages. Firstly, words of affirmation, quality time, receiving gifts, acts of service, and physical touch. And this understanding of those languages can actually help comprehend what our partners and we perceive and express as love. Now, I remember working with a couple where he was a truck driver, this big burly bloke, and his wife, who was like 5'2", petite, and he looked like he'd come in dragged by the chain. And as he sat down and she sits down, I sort of open up and says, so what do you think I can do to help the two of you? What brings you into therapy? And she goes, well, it's lots of stuff. And, as she's about to begin to unpack it, he turns around and he goes, no, hang on a minute. And I had watched his body language, and the moment she started talking, his eyes almost rolled back into the back of his head. And he says, look at this. He said, I think I do most things that a bloke can do for his wife. I'll give you an example of the last weekend. So, I got up, I washed a new car, which I got her recently, made sure that the inside outside's all nice and clean. And she talked about having, a desire. He didn't use that word actually, but, that she wanted a rose garden in the backyard. All right. So I packed up my truck and I went up, to Flower Power, and I had a look around, and I talked to the blokes there about, what would be a nice assortment. I've packed them all in, brought them home, and spent the weekend, creating a nice little area for those roses. And I looked at her and I said, well, what do you think? What's your husband trying to say? And she goes, well, yeah, that's all very well and good. And I went, hang on a minute, did you appreciate that? And she says, oh, yeah, no problem. And it was sort of matter-of-factly delivered. And we kept talking a little bit. They kept filling me in on other frustrations and so on. And at one point, it was like she sort of snapped. And she said, he never tells me that he loves me. And he sort of looked a bit sheepish, and I turned to him and I said, is that true? And he says, mate, I come from a family where we didn't talk a lot about emotions, right? So I'm not comfortable with that, but I do pretty well what I think she needs and wants. And, in other words, what he was delivering was acts of service. But what she needed was to hear the right words. So at this point, let me talk a little bit then about this whole idea, how this connects with, our social ideology, patriarchy. Well, he was a good example. This trucker was a good example about what's expected of men in our culture, where, we might hold power, but we've learned to reduce our level of emotional expression. Some of us don't show a great deal of empathy. And when it gets really bad, is some of us just become downright narcissistic, and we exercise that in a sort of power imbalance where we're the top dog and, she sort of fits in underneath the pecking order somewhere. So I gather you can now see that there's going to be some issues around this. But the other part that's really important to remember is that when we go into understanding our way in which we function in our relationships, our romantic relationships, there's a theory that's really important called object relations theory. And this theory suggests that our experiences with important figures from our childhood, objects as they're referred to, influence how we view and interact with others in adulthood. So, unresolved issues from those early relationships can project onto our adult romantic relationship. So, if we felt, we could never be good enough, at some point in our relationships, we often fall into the trap of thinking that we're just not good enough for the other person. All right? So, if we begin to use that framework and understand our attachment styles and understand each other more deeply in terms of, what our social stereotypes are about, we can begin to shift into what I call non-patriarchal romantic relationships. And that is, where we're more open to emotional expression, we are open with empathy, we are better communicators. All right. In other words, what we're doing is fostering emotional intelligence within the context of our relationship. So, challenging these social ideologies, these social stereotypes, can really function as tempering, as strengthening our romantic relationship. So the important thing I want everybody who's going to be reflecting on this to take out of it, in a sense, is that this is not just about expressing and receiving love, but it's also a fundamental platform for personal growth and then subsequently social change. In one of the other podcasts, I talked about the fact that patriarchal fathers raise even more patriarchal sons. Right? Do we want this to continue? Well, from my position of dealing with men and boys all the time, the answer is a blatant no. So our journey with all the stops and turns really begins to take shape when we begin to understand the psychological foundations that reshape our relationships, the dynamics in the relationships, and how we can create healthier and more fulfilling connections. So, what I want everybody to reflect on is, what stuff from your past keeps haunting you? I don't want to sound sort of cliche, but are there daddy issues, mummy issues? Did you come home with a really good mark on your assignment? Let's say it was 85 or 90, and, your parents said to you, as they always do, well, where's the rest of the mark? So could you never quite get it right? There's all sorts of dynamics in this, and I might unpack some of that in the next episode, because it might be really useful to help everybody get a sense of how can I really use this on a practical level. I think it is really, really important to generate an audit. And it's a bit like doing an inventory, And my personal inventory is about my attitudes, beliefs, self-talk, my relationship with myself, how I see the world. You know, a lot of times we actually have conflict with someone else, not because of who they are, but rather because I'm projecting unresolved, unfinished business onto them. Sometimes it's because I haven't learned yet to emotionally regulate in a mature way. You know, at the moment I'm looking through the media and we've got Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg shaping up for a showdown in the ring. And people are excited. It gets, media excitement plus, and social media is going crazy with this stuff. And I look at it and I go, well, there's two adolescents in adult bodies who are playing, let's find out whose dick's bigger than the others. That's really very, very mature. And one of the things that's very clearly come out about Elon Musk in lots and lots of different sort of areas where they've taken a close look at him is this is a man who constantly needs to be at the top of the mountain. You know, the way that he dealt with Tesla and what he's doing, with Twitter, all of this is just about his own sense of grandiosity and the need, the almost pathological need for the spotlight. This is not a good way to live. So, is he going to necessarily be a great match in a relationship? I doubt it. It'd be interesting to hear his previous partners describe what he was like in the relationship. If we want to be healthy and well-rounded in a relationship, we need to do our own stock take. We need to get in and stick our hand where it's messy and where it's squishy and where it's, I'd rather not go, but it's important that we do go because you need to own it. And before you start blaming the other person, make sure that you've done your own homework. Get your own house in order. In other words, if you're going to leave the house as your bedmate, that's one example. All right. So that's it for today. So let me wrap it up. If you have any questions or you want to take this to a deeper level, please reach out. We're here. So until our next journey together, I'd like you to continue to challenge the norms, inspire change, and strive for healthier, more fulfilling relationships. Because again, we do not live as islands. We are all in some way in relationship with someone. Hopefully more than someone. Hopefully many. Until next time, this is me signing off.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.